Hey guys, I am the Comics Kid 2099, and it has been a few months since I did a review from this series. I am here to talk about the complete Age of Apocalypse epic, Book 3. I don't like that Rogue is basically drawn like her 616 counterpart. If you'll recall, from around this time period, Rogue had really long hair, like down to her ankles. But in the Age of Apocalypse, she actually had hair that was about down to her neck, give or take, down to her shoulders at best. And then here, she's drawn like Starfire from the Teen Titans with just huge hair. And I don't really like that. This is by John Romita Jr., who is an artist that I don't really care about. I know a lot of people really love Romita Jr. I am not one of those people. I don't hate his artwork. There are times when I think, hey, he really is working great here. Most of the time I look at his work and I'm saying, I don't really like what he's doing there. So anyway, now that I've complained about something really minor and trivial, let me talk about the book itself. First, I guess I should go ahead and mention which all comic books are collected in this book. This has Excalibur issue 2 and 3, Astonishing X-Men issues 2, 3, and 4, Generation Next issues 2 and 3, X-Men issues 2 and 3, Factor X issue 3, Amazing X-Men issue 3, Weapon X issue 3, Gambit and the Externals issue 3, and X-Universe issue 1. I have been talking throughout all of these videos about how the books that I've been reading in the Age of Apocalypse collection feel very fluffy and don't feel very necessary. The Prelude book, I thought that felt like about half of it you really didn't need to read for the Legion Quest storyline. Only about half of what was collected in that book was really necessary for the whole story. And then Volume 1 is actually just a whole bunch of prequel issues that really have nothing to do with the overall story of the Age of Apocalypse. They are set in the Age of Apocalypse, but they don't really have any bearing on the overall story. And then it's really with Volume 2 where things actually get started. This volume, I don't want to say that it's unnecessary. It's definitely not as bad as Volume 1. It's not even as bad as the Prelude version. This just feels like when you're reading a story, especially a longer story, and then right in the middle of the story, it feels like just nothing is really happening and they've really stretched it very thin just so that they can make the story a little bit longer. This entire book feels a little bit like that. There are entire issues in this book where I'm reading it and technically it's part of the main narrative, but I don't think that a whole lot of important stuff is happening. For example, one of my favorite Age of Apocalypse minis was Generation Next, because I was a really huge fan of Scott Lobdell and Chris Bachalo's Generation X. The first 25 or so issues of that series are really excellent comic books, and these 4 issues that are part of the Age of Apocalypse are also by those 2 creators. So I was really digging that miniseries the last time I read it, which was several years ago, and when I'm reading it now, I'm realizing, okay, issue 2, almost nothing happens. It's literally just looking around at each of these guys and kind of seeing their reaction to the mission. We see Husk and Vincent. They are doing something and then they react to how the mission looks like a suicide mission. Then we see Skin and Jono, and they're over here and they say, hey, this looks like a suicide mission. And then you've got Colossus and Kitty Pryde. They're over here saying, hey, this is a suicide mission. And that was the entire issue. And there are several issues in this book that are like that. The only series in this entire book that actually feels like it accomplishes anything is Astonishing X-Men, because the last 3 issues of that 4-issue mini are all collected in this book. So with all of the other series that are collected here, most of them are either 2 issues or 1 issue, and so it doesn't feel like a whole lot of headway is made with any of those issues. For example, we only get 1 issue of Amazing X-Men and 1 issue of Gambit and the Externals, and while a couple of these issues actually have a whole lot of important stuff going on, it also feels like, okay, we're here, we're with Gambit and his team, and then we don't see them again until the next book. And that's kind of where I want to touch on something that I mentioned in one of my previous videos. I think in my review of Volume 2, I mentioned that this whole event was really interconnected, and I mentioned that as a good way last time. I talked about how I thought that it was going to be 9 4-issue minis, and each of them basically stand on their own, and they don't really cross paths, and so you don't really have to read any of them because they all basically stand on their own. And I was actually surprised to see that I was wrong. You had the 4-issue Weapon X series, that crossed over with Amazing X-Men. Amazing X-Men crosses over with Astonishing X-Men, and then Amazing X-Men eventually sort of holds hands with Gambit and the External. And then you've got some really important stuff going on with Generation Next. Basically, everything here feels pretty necessary to the overall narrative. The problem, I think, comes when they decided they were going to make each miniseries be 4 issues long, and so sometimes the overall goal of an entire miniseries felt a little stretched out and a little fluff whenever you're trying to make it happen over the course of 4 issues. For example, Generation Next, their overall goal was to go and rescue Colossus' little sister, Illyana Rasputin. And I don't really think it needed 4 entire issues for that to happen. That's probably why issue 2, nothing at all really happens, and then in the last 2 issues, a little bit more happens in the way of plot. So while I thought it was actually a good thing when I was reading Volume 2 that all of these miniseries tie together, and this is actually one gigantic story happening over the course of several volumes, when I'm reading this volume a few months later, it's really not as much of a good thing as I thought it was then. For one thing, it's been a little while since I read Volume 2, so a lot of the plot points for each individual series I had actually forgotten, and so reading this, I was having a little bit of trouble keeping up with what was going on. In some of these issues, you've got a full page or so of expository dialogue, which when you're reading a comic book series and you might read an entire storyline all in one day, the expository dialogue that all happens on one page might get on your nerves because you just read the previous issue like an hour ago. For me, I haven't read the previous issue of Gambit and the Externals since September of this year. It was helpful to see Deathbird telling Gambit, okay, this is what we're doing, just in case you haven't read the previous issues or it's been a while since you have. With some of these other series, for example, Weapon X and Factor X, I thought that those were a little harder to jump onto, but for the most part, I was able to keep up fairly well. And it really is only dawning on me now that it must have been really aggravating for people back in the day who might have been interested in 1 or 2 of these minis, and then they read, say, an issue of Factor X, and suddenly Jean Grey, who hasn't been in this series for the first 2 issues, shows up in issue 3, and you're saying, whoa, where did she come from? Why is she suddenly important? And you realize you probably should have been reading the Weapon X series along with this, and it's all like a series of dominoes. If you have to read Weapon X in order to understand Factor X, then you realize you probably should be reading Amazing X-Men to see how that crosses over with Weapon X, and then that's one of the core books, and then basically you're buying all 9 of these miniseries just to see what's going on with the 1 or 2 minis that you were originally interested in the first place. There are really only 2 series in the overall Weapon X narrative that I would say are unnecessary, and both of them are represented here in this book. One is X-Man. I had never read X-Man until I started reading these Age of Apocalypse books, and I have to say, just from what I'm seeing here, I really don't think that I missed out all that much at all. Number one, Nate Gray is a disappointing character. He is really annoying. He's basically just a spoiled brat, which you would think isn't very easy to achieve in a dystopian world like the Age of Apocalypse, but Nate Gray is a spoiled brat who's arrogant and annoying, and I don't like reading about him. And so far, I've read 3 issues of the X-Men miniseries, and I don't feel like anything important has happened. Now, granted, at the very end of issue 3, something pretty important happens that I assume is going to make X-Men cross paths with the other characters in the Age of Apocalypse. But I have to wonder, what was the point of this entire miniseries if it wasn't going to really have any bearing on the overall story? And I know that the whole point of the Age of Apocalypse storyline was that each of the existing X-Men titles would be replaced by a new title for the Age of Apocalypse. And so, since you have Cable, who is himself a displaced soldier from the future, well, you've got to come up with some way to replace that series for 4 issues in the Age of Apocalypse. I guess I can understand why they needed X-Man / Nate Gray in this world, but I do wish that they had found a way to integrate him a little better into the overall narrative. narrative. And while we're at it, maybe he could be a lot less annoying, but that's probably just a character arc thing where he starts off as a whiny kid and then grows up a little bit. I don't know, I guess I'll have to read issue 4 to see if that's what they do with this character or not. The other series that I thought was overall pretty pointless and useless in the Age of Apocalypse narrative was X Universe. I mentioned earlier that the first issue is collected in this book. Basically, X Universe is about various human characters that we know and recognize from the Marvel Universe who are all part of the underground movement working against Apocalypse. So you have characters like Gwen Stacy, Dr. Donald Blake, Clint Barton, Tony Stark, Dr. Doom. They're all working together, and I just didn't think that this entire first issue really accomplished anything at all other than introducing us to our cast. And that would be fine if this was a 4-issue miniseries, but X Universe was only 2 issues long. So when you take literally half of the allotted pages that you have to introduce us to characters that we already know, that's kind of a problem. And yeah, sure, these characters are going to be a little different from their 616 counterparts, but I don't think we needed an entire issue just to show us these characters who exist in the Age of Apocalypse. We probably could have spent half of this issue getting introduced to all of the characters and then show some actual plot development. But sadly, we don't really get any of that in this issue, so I felt like the whole thing is just meaningless. And if you're wondering if you should read it, I'm going to say no, you shouldn't. The rest of this book, yeah, sure, go ahead. If you have the previous volumes of the complete Age of Apocalypse epic series, then absolutely, go ahead and get volume 3. It does meander a little bit because for most of this book, the conclusion has not happened yet, so it's just kind of trying to kill time waiting for the conclusion that will happen in volume 4. But yeah, if you've got the other volumes, I would say go ahead and read this book. Maybe I should go ahead and amend something I said just a few minutes ago. I said there were only 2 series in the overall Age of Apocalypse that were pretty pointless. Make that 3. X Chronicles was another 2-issue mini that happened within this world, and I thought it really didn't accomplish a whole lot either. Both of those issues were meant to be set in the past, showing how various characters died or broke ties with the X-Men, stuff like that. I didn't mention that earlier when I said there were only 2 series that really didn't have any impact on the AOA, but that's because X Chronicles is not represented in this book, so I didn't feel the need to mention it. But yeah, I would go ahead and say there are 3 series overall that don't really have any reason to be here. X-Men, X-Universe, and X-Men Chronicles. So, that's about all I have to say here, guys. I overall enjoyed this, even though most of it I felt like was kind of filler, or at the very least was just kind of piddling, taking its time, waiting to get to the end of all things, which is going to be happening in the next volume. So I would definitely say go ahead and pick this up. Like I said, I enjoyed it. I think you will too if you are into alternate universes and the X-Men and stuff like that. And so I am going to try to read Volume 4 and get it reviewed by next week. I won't make any promises, but I definitely am going to try and get that done sooner than I did this volume. So no more 3-month gaps before you see the review to Volume 4. And if you've been sitting here waiting for me to review this volume and the next volume, I'm sorry that it took me this long. I've just been reading and watching a lot of other stuff, trying to get stuff out for this channel, and also just reading stuff for my enjoyment. And before I knew it, 3 months happened and I didn't realize that it had been that long. So I apologize for that. I hope that this video found you well. I hope you enjoyed it and found the video to be helpful. And if you did, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe. And I will be back tomorrow with some other kind of video. So until then, I'll see you guys tomorrow. Have a great day.